The 1920 Government of Ireland Act, which became law exactly a century ago, created Northern Ireland and partition. It is the single most important piece of British legislation of the 20th century relating to Ireland, in that it established a new constitutional and political arrangement, devolved government and partition, which continues to exist to this day. The Act formalised the devolution of government responsibilities to a 6-county Northern Ireland that survived the negotiations resulting in the Anglo-Irish Treaty the following year in 1921, as well as outlasting the unpublished conclusions of the subsequent Irish Boundary Commission in 1924-25. Although never implemented in the rest of Ireland, the Act also reconfirmed the principle of self-government for the remainder of Ireland, which was realised by the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the establishment of the 26-county Irish Free State in 1922, and ultimately the fully sovereign Republic of Ireland in 1949. Above all, it established the principle of a partitioned Ireland, which continues to form the basis of the constitutional arrangement in Ireland to this day. The Government of Ireland Act was replaced by the Northern Ireland Act, which, subsequent to the Good Friday Agreement, re-established a devolved legislature for Northern Ireland following the abolition of Stormont in 1972. It also empowered the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to call a referendum or border poll if it appeared likely that a majority of electors in Northern Ireland would prefer to join an all-Ireland state. Unlike other contenders for the accolade of most significant piece of Anglo-Irish legislation of the 20th century, the Government of Ireland Act was passed during, not after, a period of intense civil and political strife. This involved an escalating guerrilla war by Republican separatists against British military and administrative interests in Ireland, as well as the spread of a rapidly deteriorating intercommunal sectarian strife in the north of the country. In contrast, the 1922 Irish Free State Agreement Act gave the force of law to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of the previous year after hostilities between Irish Republicans and the British state had ceased. The Ireland Act of 1949 retrospectively dealt with the constitutional consequences of Ireland's Republic of Ireland Act 1948, such as its exit from the British Commonwealth, as well as reconfirming Northern Ireland's position as part of the United Kingdom. Finally, the Good Friday Agreement and subsequent Northern Ireland Act 1998 followed on from the cessation of a nearly 30-year-long IRA campaign. For such a significant piece of legislation, the 1920 Act is inexplicably overshadowed by preceding similar proposals. There were, in effect, 4 Irish Home Rule bills dating back to 1886. The earliest bill fell at the first hurdle in the Commons. The second, in 1893, made it to the Lords, but was defeated there by the Conservative majority. And the third, in 1914, made it to the statute book, but was subsequently overwhelmed by the upheavals of the First World War. All of these proposed varying amounts of devolution to a Dublin government, and all of them failed. The fourth Home Rule Bill, which ultimately became the Government of Ireland Act, was the only Home Rule Bill to even be partially implemented. Ironically, this implementation only extended to that part of Ireland, the Unionist North, which had been most adamant in rejecting Home Rule on 3 previous occasions. The Act's implementation in Home Rule Ireland was a non-starter, with neither nationalist electors or politicians being consulted on its proposals. Although the Government of Ireland Bill was the first Home Rule Bill to propose partition, it was an open secret ever since the passing of the Third Home Rule Act in 1914 that the special provision for Ulster that Prime Minister Asquith constantly referred to would inevitably result in some sort of partition proposal being put forward in an attempt to solve the Irish conundrum. The British government certainly had contingency plans for such an eventuality as early as 1914. These involved the continuation of county boundaries as the proposed border between the two parts of Ireland, as the difficulties created of local government boards, county councils, and existing parliamentary constituencies were split across two jurisdictions was obviously too much to contemplate. This line of thinking, which fortuitously coincided with the political outlook of the Ulster Unionist and was carried through to the framing of the Government of Ireland Bill, avoided a fourth partition being proposed by the bill. Not only the partition of the United Kingdom, the partition of Ireland, the partition of the province of Ulster, but also the possible partition of individual counties. Civil servants conscientiously produced their recommendations, and copies of their maps were circulated to politicians, including Home Rule leader John Redmond and Unionist leader Sir Edward Carson, attending the abortive Buckingham Palace Conference on Ireland in July 1914, which was a last-ditch attempt before the coming war to resolve the issue in Ireland. As there was no agreement at the conference, and as the country moved towards war, and any further negotiation on a settlement in Ireland was postponed for the duration of the war, the maps were folded away only to see the light of day again when the British government was forced to return to the Irish conundrum at the end of the First World War. By that time, however, the political situation in both Ireland, Britain, and indeed throughout Europe had been overwhelmingly transformed. The Republicans were now in the ascendant in Ireland. A Conservative-dominated coalition government sympathetic to Ulster Unionism now ruled in Britain after the outcome of the 1918 general election. And in the Europe of the post-war world and the Europe of the Treaty of Versailles, the new watchword was self-determination. In 1920, the new British government now felt confident and secure enough to offer in peacetime what was impossible to offer in 1916 in wartime: Home Rule. It is important to realise that Ireland was partitioned under the Government of Ireland Act well before hostilities between British forces and the IRA had ceased. This legislation was on the statute book for a year before the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and the Government of Ireland Act's driving principle, partition, was not overturned by the treaty. Partition was facilitated through the abandonment of the House of Commons by the newly elected Sinn Féin MPs, leaving only a rump of 7 Home Rule MPs to argue Nationalist Ireland's cause. This vacuum was filled by the only Irish representatives present at Westminster, the Unionists, with their close links to the Conservative Party. Ironically, the Nationalist complaint that they were not consulted about the terms of the Government Ireland Act through not attending Westminster was repeated the following year by the Unionists, who complained about not being involved in, or at least consulted about, the Anglo-Irish Treaty. From now on, the Unionists adopted as their guiding star the principles laid down by the Government of Ireland Act, a 6-county Northern Ireland, and the partition of the country, from which they refused to be deviated. Clearly, in 1918, after the successful conclusion of the war, and following his resounding general election success, the Prime Minister Lloyd George had to take immediate action to attempt to resolve the outstanding Irish issue. Legally, the 1914 Home Rule Act was still on the statute book, as some sort of Home Rule had to be implemented. The new peacetime coalition government had 3 options. It could either implement the Home Rule Act with an amending bill to exclude Ulster, it could repeal it, or it could supersede it with new legislation. Lloyd George chose the latter option and appointed Walter Long to chair a new cabinet committee on Ireland, which was charged with seeking a way forward. In appointing Long, Lloyd George effectively acknowledged that any new policy must attract widespread Tory as well as Unionist support. Long had been Chief Secretary for Ireland in the previous Conservative government and chairman of the Irish Unionist MPs in the House of Commons from 1906 to 1910. His appointment was designed to guarantee the acquiescence of Tory backbenchers and to reassure Southern Irish Unionists who still had considerable influence, particularly with Conservative peers in the House of Lords, and who were growing increasingly alarmed at the prospect of being abandoned by their fellow Unionists in the North. By the time Long's committee had begun to meet, Home Rule in its original form was basically dead as a solution to the Irish problem. In the 1918 general election, the Home Rulers had been replaced in Ireland by more ideological Republican separatists. Furthermore, the government was beginning to have to concentrate on a growing violent Republican insurgency in Ireland. The 1920 Government of Ireland Act, which finally established partition, was the ultimate outcome of Long's committee, as well as being the direct descendant of the pre-war Third Home Rule Act. Given that rapid political change had occurred in both Britain and Ireland in the interim, in effect, the Act dealt with the Irish political situation as it was before rather than after the war. In 1918, towards the end of the war, an earlier version of Long's Cabinet Committee had in fact begun to work within an ideological framework of federalism for the entire British Isles, foreshadowing the basic outlines of what was to become the Government of Ireland Act 2 years later. Following the Home Rule controversy, this had appeared to many intellectuals to be an attractive proposition which could potentially square the circle of preserving the unity of the United Kingdom whilst giving political recognition to the diversity inside it. This earlier 1918 committee proposed a Council of Ireland and the exclusion for a 6-county Ulster subject to a plebiscite at the end of the war, together with a confirmatory referendum 7 years later. This early version was rejected by the Cabinet, which believed it was inappropriate to consider such a radical constitutional realignment while the Irish situation was deteriorating so rapidly. In addition, many Conservatives also believed that federalism was being used as a convenient pragmatic device merely to extricate the government from its Irish difficulties. The British Labour Party, however, despite its official policy of historically supporting traditional Home Rule, was supportive. And leading members such as J.H. Thomas, who was to become Labour's spokesman on Ireland, and Arthur Henderson, began to suggest the application of the federal principle to the entire United Kingdom. They argued that federalism could be the answer to the dilemma of needing to preserve the Union whilst protecting both Ulster and Southern Irish Unionists, and at the same time granting nationalist Ireland what could no longer be denied to them. However, Ulster Unionists saw federalism as Home Rule by another name, and nationalist Ireland by 1918 had advanced substantially forward from demanding traditional Home Rule as a solution. In the end, Lloyd George felt that it was more important and pragmatically more desirable to deal with the Irish question directly and delay consideration of the larger issue of federalism. Long personally believed that the Cabinet had made a mistake in pushing a purely Irish solution rather than a more inclusive federal bill, but Lloyd George's political instincts proved to be correct. Federalism was quietly dropped in mid-1918 when it became obvious that it had no mass support in other parts of the United Kingdom, most crucially Scotland and Wales, nor in England or amongst Irish nationalists or unionists. Nevertheless, the controversy over Ireland and the debate as to whether the country's national aspirations could be accommodated within the confines of the United Kingdom as it was constituted at the beginning of the 20th century, did stimulate a lengthy debate on the issue of federalism. It's difficult to appreciate now the extent to which that debate took centre stage during this period. Many contemporary opinion formers and politicians from all parties believe that a federal reconstituting of the United Kingdom could provide a solution to the seemingly intractable problem of how to reconcile divergent national aspirations in Ireland. They were also convinced that devolution of power to Scotland and Wales could provide a readjustment of the constitutional equilibrium away from what they interpreted as the unhealthy centralism of power that had been allowed to develop inside the United Kingdom. Even though the arguments for federalism were fatally flawed by the fact that the populations of Scotland and Wales transparently did not have the same thirst for home rule as the Irish, the influence of the Federalist argument can be traced in Lloyd George's proposed solution to the Irish problem as it was in 1919 and 1920. Although the idea of federalism as a solution to the centrifugal forces endangering the integrity of the United Kingdom inevitably declined and collapsed after the decision to allow most of Ireland to leave the United Kingdom, it provided the philosophical underpinning for the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, which would establish Northern Ireland and lay the legislative foundation for the creation of the Irish border the following year. In October 1919, Long's second Cabinet Committee on Ireland agreed to propose separate parliaments for North and South, with matters relating to the Crown, such as defence, foreign affairs, international trade and currency excluded, alongside a common council with powers for the whole island being established. In addition, the devolved assemblies were forbidden to make laws aimed at religious discrimination. The theory was that all of this would ultimately dovetail with the adoption of a federal system of government for the entire United Kingdom. Long's proposal was developed into an all-Ireland federal council, whose powers could be granted if the two parliaments together agreed to delegate such authority. This theoretically could satisfy the pledge not to coerce or betray Ulster, as well as guaranteeing British withdrawal from all of Ireland. From a British perspective, this was an attractive proposition, as it would theoretically free Britain from the continuous immersion in Irish problems it had experienced over the previous 40 years. The committee rejected calls for a plebiscite, echoing Balfour's criticism that Ireland should not be treated and carved up like a conquered Central European state after the First World War. Long also betrayed his southern Irish origins and his southern unionist origins when he proposed a 9-county Ulster, as he saw this as ultimately facilitating reunification. The Ulster Unionists, however, still committed to what, from their perspective, would be a viable northern political entity, only wanted 6 counties and no more. The Cabinet, obviously preferring to have the Unionist support for the proposal, consequently backed down in order to make the whole scheme work. The Northern Unionists had to be mollified. Ironically, despite this concession, all the Unionist MPs at Westminster voted against the Act. Their preference was for Ulster to remain inside the United Kingdom, and the proposed Northern Home Rule state was their default option, although Carson helpfully added that once parliamentary institutions had been granted, they could not then be interfered with. The Government of Ireland Act became law in December 1920. 2 parliaments, both bicameral, a House of Lords amendment approved a Senate being established in the south in order to bolster southern Irish minorities, followed by a similar amendment proposing one for Northern Ireland, were then established. The new 6-county state and the Irish border came into existence on the 3rd of May 1921. Lloyd George's main concern given the Conservative domination of the coalition government, was to provide a solution to the Ulster question that would be congenial to the Tories and their allies, the Ulster Unionists, before turning his skills towards negotiating a settlement for the rest of Ireland, where political instability and violence were now endemic. Undoubtedly, the passing of the Government of Ireland Act enabled Lloyd George to satisfy the Ulster Unionists and his Conservative government allies prior to commencing negotiations with the resurgent Irish nationalists. The Government of Ireland Act did not coincide with any Irish political aspiration. It was a British coalition cabinet compromise aimed at delivering the maximum measure of devolution compatible with its own survival and with public, especially Conservative Party, opinion in Britain. In this, Lloyd George was assisted by the refusal of the newly elected Sinn Féin MPs to take their seats at Westminster, which meant that nationalist Ireland had no input into the legislation nor into the parliamentary debate on the subsequent Anglo-Irish Treaty. From a British perspective, the partition solution establishing two Irish parliaments, one in Northern Ireland and one in Southern Ireland, theoretically took Ireland out of the realm of British politics, allowing Britain to withdraw from Ireland on her own terms. Elections for the Southern Ireland Parliament on the 24th of May 1921 became elections for the second Dáil, where Sinn Féin was unopposed in 124 out of the 128 seats. The Parliament of Southern Ireland, set up by the Government of Ireland Act, met only once with 4 Unionists. It was then adjourned indefinitely and was ultimately disbanded and overtaken by the Irish Free State Agreement Act 1922. It ceased to exist on the 6th of December 1922 when the Irish Free State Constitution legally came into force. The theory was that because the Irish could now govern themselves, no Irish person could ever again complain about domination from Westminster. All Ireland was now autonomous, and ultimate reunification, a particular concern expressed by Britain's allies, the United States, and the dominions of the British Empire, particularly towards the end of the war, could be facilitated on an agreed basis in accordance with the topical principle of self-determination recently established by the Treaty of Versailles. Even with the benefit of a century of hindsight, it is difficult to imagine an alternative option to partition and the establishment of a border in Ireland that would have made sense from the British point of view if their overriding concern was to withdraw from Ireland without coercing Ulster. If the Home Rulers, rather than Sinn Féin, had been the dominant political force in the south, the Act would have been a brilliant solution. Previous Home Rule proposals of 1886, 1893 and 1912-14 had founded on the rock of Unionist opposition. Ironically, the Government of Ireland Act, the fourth Home Rule Bill, satisfied Ulster, or most of it, but not the extreme nationalists of Sinn Féin, who were now the new masters in the south, where the Government of Ireland Act remained a dead letter amid escalating and relentless political violence. The Act, however, was the only one of the 4 Home Rule Bills to come into even partial effect. In this, it reflected the new Tory-dominated balance of power at Westminster, but it is an irony that the only part of Ireland not wanting Home Rule was the only part to get it. From a Conservative perspective, it was obvious as early as 1917, if not before, that an Irish settlement involving some sort of Home Rule was essential to the war effort in order to attract the United States into the war, and was probably an inevitable necessity to ensure the survival of the empire after the war, given the concern and anxiety shown by the Dominions towards Britain's Irish policy. It's also apparent that Conservative support for the Ulster Unionist case weakened between 1913 and 1918, undoubtedly because since 1916 the Conservatives had been the dominant partners in the wartime coalition government, and there was no longer a need to play the orange card, aligning with Unionists in Ireland for political gain in the quest for office. Furthermore, as the Irish crisis intensified, it became increasingly obvious to both parties that although their short-term interests might coincide, the Conservatives were ultimately concerned about the future post-war welfare of the United Kingdom as a whole, whereas the Ulster Unionists' overriding concern was for their own identity in Ireland. Labour Party attitudes to Ireland were also changing. Prior to, and even after the war, the Labour Party had provided general, vague and unthinking support for the political demands of moderate Irish nationalists. It became clear, however, that if the Labour Party aspired to become the governing party in the British state, that it had to distance itself from the revolutionary politics which had rapidly come to dominate Irish nationalism since 1918. Unlike the Conservatives, the Labour Party had no political debts to pay in Ireland. There had never been a cohesive and logically planned Irish policy in the Labour Party. For historical reasons, nearly all the party, except that in Belfast, had a deep and genuinely held emotional attachment to the moderate policies of the Home Rulers. Labour shared the Home Rulers' abhorrence of partition as a threat to the territorial integrity of Ireland. Consequently, Labour opposition to the Government of Ireland Act provided certainty at a time when its own policies on Ireland were in a state of flux, as it was increasingly criticised for slavishly following the traditional Home Rule policy when it was obvious that mainstream political demands in nationalist Ireland had moved well beyond that. Inevitably, the party's cautious constitutionalism and parliamentarianism began to be threatened by its more radical members and some, though not a majority, of its Irish voters in Britain, who demanded direct action and a closer identification with the extra-parliamentary nationalism of Sinn Féin. The Irish border, demarcating the 6 counties of Northern Ireland from the rest of the country, became a reality on the 3rd of April 1921. Ironically, it first of all separated a Home Rule Northern Ireland from the bulk of the island that was still run directly from Westminster. Initially, Ulster Unionists had been suspicious about the offer of a separate parliament in Belfast, fearing that it was some sort of dastardly ploy to detach them from the rest of the United Kingdom by treating them as semi-detached members who at some stage in the future could be delivered into the jaws of an all-Ireland state. They quickly warmed to the idea, however, when they saw that a separate parliament for Ulster, permanently controlled by Unionists and in charge of their own security, gave them added insurance against peremptory expulsion from the United Kingdom in the future. From then on, all the political energies of the Unionists would be directed into maintaining the border that had come into existence that spring in 1921.